Hello, I have returned. I am going to be talking about weird fiction and bizarro and so on in other episodes, but today I want to talk about my favourite biographies. Next week I'm going to continue that, but I'm going to talk about controversial biographies, and you'll see what I mean when it appears in your YouTube. Right, well, I love the 20s. I like to think my personal style is 20s via psychedelic 60s and 90s grunge, or I don't know, something like that. I love Dorothy Parker and F. Scott Fitzgerald and so on. And a biography I read recently is about Zelda Fitzgerald, his wife. No, it's not the one that the recent series is about, Zed, the Beginning of Everything. It's not the one based on that. It's a biography by Nancy Milford, and it's quite good at trying to sort of remain impartial, because I don't know if you know much about the Fitzgeralds, but Zelda had mental health problems and Scott had alcohol problems. You know, the author of The Great Gatsby, he was, and I really like him as a writer. It must have been very difficult for him, and you do see his side in things, or you should try, but it's so frustrating when it highlights things that happen, such as Zelda wanted to write a book of her own experiences, and Scott had been using her diary and things that they'd done together as fodder for his stuff. And when she wrote her book, he wanted to have a look at it and he was furious, and he was saying, you can't have this bit in it, you shouldn't talk about this, and because I want to use that for mine, I'm the professional writer. And it's really like an upsetting read, but it's very interesting. One of the first flappers, but it kind of highlights how delicate that whole image is, how you can be kind of seen as a figure of fun and an icon, but behind that there's often a lot more going on, and she was trying to live up to her image and ultimately she couldn't, and it broke her. So I recommend that. It's called Zelda by Nancy Milford. The next is Wishing on the Moon by Donald Clark, about Billie Holiday. She's another fascinating figure, because I get the sense that she liked a bit of a joke, because her autobiography, Lady Sings the Blues, is mostly fiction. She kind of created these myths about herself, and she is quite a mythical figure anyway, but it's a lot of it's fiction, and the film that was based on it kind of reiterates certain stories about her which actually have turned out not to be true. She's kind of seen as a victim, and all these terrible things happened to her, and you know, a lot of bad things did happen to her. It was a difficult time, and she went through some harsh things, but she was never really a victim. She's quite a tough lady, and that's something that I really enjoyed finding out about, and I think that it's a good book to read. The next is a really fun read. It's called Courtesans by Katie Hickman, and it's about Georgian, I mean, it kind of spans onto the Victorian period, but it's mainly about Georgian courtesans and how they were seen as these glamorous figures, and for some reason in this period they became very almost celebrated, but there was always an edge of disapproval somewhere. And the way that ladies of society would meet up and have tea, they would meet up with each other, because they weren't quite accepted into society, even though a lot of gentlemen were visiting them, and they did sort of parade around with riches and horse and carts that were very expensive. And the way that I would kind of equate them now is something like the Kardashians, where it sounds ridiculous, but they have the same kind of duality, in that you get people looking at them and thinking, wow, they're fabulous, they've got this, they've got that, and you know, they're doing very well for themselves. But you've also got the other half which look on them with disdain, like, well, they're just like, how are they even famous, you know? And to be honest, I'd say that was probably the equivalent of the time. And it focuses on I think it's five particular courtesans, beginning with the earliest and moving on. The lead up to it gives you a kind of background into how sex work and courtesans were seen during the period beforehand, and then it kind of launches into their stories. And sometimes it's very sad, as you can imagine. It kind of brings the excitement that people would have felt about them at the time. The next is Geisha of Gin by Minako Iwasaki. She actually was the lady interviewed by the author for Memoirs of a Geisha. And when the book came out, she was furious because he'd interviewed her extensively about the life of a geisha, and she'd said to him, please just don't put my name anywhere on the book. And when it came out, she saw that in the foreword, in the acknowledgements, he'd not only included her name, but he'd added all this other stuff about prostitution, about them being prostitutes and so on, which is fine, but she says that is not what she did, and that's not what the other geisha did. Now, his is a work of fiction, so it depends on how you feel about that, really. It's kind of a difficult one. But she was angry because she felt that 90% of it was her story, and there was this kind of salaciousness added on top of it. And the other geisha were furious, and a lot of them were complaining that they were now getting requests from men that they'd not really had very often or at all before. So she decided to write her own, and I really enjoyed it. It feels like she's come around for tea and she's telling you from start to finish exactly how it was, and it gives you a glimpse into a time when feudal Japan was changing into modern Japan. So it's a glimpse into a very specific era, and it's a glimpse into a way of life that might not be going on for that much longer, actually, because the discipline that you needed to be a geisha is crazy. Like, I know I couldn't do it. I couldn't remotely do it. And the homesickness, the getting up at crazy hours, the constant rehearsal. And they kind of saw themselves as living art dolls, I guess. They were living artwork. They lived to create art for the people who came to pay for their company. And their conversation, their dance, everything, it was like an art performance, like performance art. And just 24 hours a day, a non-stop performance art. It's really fascinating, and it's probably much better read than Memoirs of a Geisha. My next favourite is Edie, an American Girl by Jean Stein. I'm quite obsessed with Edie Sedgwick. I find her absolutely fascinating. She was one of Warhol's, not really actress, she was kind of herself in his films, and I guess you could call it like a proto reality star almost. But she was in his films, and she was just being herself, but she too ended up spiraling into drug addiction, and she always had mental health problems. She had those problems before she arrived in New York, but she also had a really bad upbringing. Her family was rich, but her father was very predatory, and yeah, she didn't have a lot of chance. But what I love about this book is that it's all interviews. It's all interviews from various people who knew her. Whilst usually you're only seeing a situation from one person's perspective, the author, you're getting possibly the same thing from lots of different people. It's not too much, it doesn't get boring, but it creates a kind of patchwork or a collage of a human being. Like, I don't know if you've seen a documentary called Dreams of a Life. That's really good, by the way, watch it. It's about a woman who you only find out about through the eyes of other people. She was, sorry, this is really morbid. She was found in her flat dead, and she'd been dead for 3 years and no one knew like who she was or anything like that. But the documentary maker found out through contacting people and getting interviews. This is kind of, it kind of gives me the same feeling, because all these different people kind of have their input in what makes her a human being to them. Like their memories of her collectively come together and form a well-rounded human. Whereas I've read some books about her which are really quite cheesy, and they talk about how wonderful she was, which, you know, I think she was wonderful, but I'm more interested in every side of her, like her bad habits and things she did that are not necessarily nice, or, you know, because those things make a person. No one's all good all the time, and that gives you a fairly good insight. The next one is Lizzie Siddal, Tragedy of a Pre-Raphaelite Supermodel by Lucinda Hawksley. I think I've got that right. She was the lady who, the Pre-Raphaelites, who were artists in London during the Victorian period, they used her as their model. I mean, they used lots of women, but she was one of the most famous ones. She's Ophelia, and she was in various others, I can't remember them. But she was in a relationship with one of the artists, and she was a laudanum addict. And again, it kind of gives you a well-rounded glimpse of her as a person. I read this from start to finish so quickly, because it was fascinating. I don't know why I'm so obsessed with these sort of fragile, delicate figures, but yeah, they really interest me, and it's really well written, and it kind of shows that even though she was unreasonable sometimes and probably really difficult to cope with, same as Zelda, same as Edie, you know, they were fascinating people. Perhaps couldn't always help what they were doing, I don't know. And finally, to end on a lighter note, because I think some of them are probably quite depressing, is The Disaster Artist by Greg Sestero. I laughed so much during this book. It's about the guy who ended up being roped into being the main actor in the film The Room. I don't know if you've seen The Room. If you watch it with other people, it starts to feel like a collective hallucination, because it's so weirdly bad. Like, it's not just bad, it's completely bizarre from start to finish. Like, you don't understand how someone could have thought that what they were making was good. And it gives you an insight into Tommy Wiseau, the filmmaker, into his brain. Well, kind of. Like, how did he think that this was a good idea? And Greg Sestero was, as I say, he was kind of roped into being the main actor, and he just details the debacle from start to finish. It is so funny. Some of the things that happen you can't quite believe actually happened. It was so much weirder backstage than I ever thought it was, and I'll just read it. I was reading out bits to my friends constantly. I think they got fed up of it, but I just couldn't stop because it was so funny. I'd be in hysterics and then I would make them listen. So, okay, and that concludes my favourite non-fiction biographies. I hope you enjoy them. If not, never mind. Okay.